Well, everybody, thank you for coming today. I'm Susan Bielstein. I'm the acquiring editor for Art and Ancient Studies at the University of Chicago Press, and I'm delighted you're joining us for a conversation between two outstanding historians and critics of modern art. Debra Bricker Balken is an independent scholar, writer, and curator who works on subjects related to American modernism and contemporary art. Two of her recent publications, which you might want to check out, the authoritative catalog raisonné of painting and things for Arthur Dove, and the publication Mark Tobey, Threading Light. Now, about 21 years ago, the University of Chicago Press published Debra's book, Philip Guston's Poor Richard, which explored Guston's caustic caricatures of Richard Nixon, which are so famous now. That project wound up leading into her research on Harold Rosenberg, who was one of the few critics who wrote about Guston's so-called late work with deep conviction and interest. The result of all that is the book we'll be discussing tonight, Harold Rosenberg, A Critic's Life, which has been 20 years in the making. And it's quite an achievement, I have to say. Debra will be, or Professor Balken will be in conversation with Martha Ward, who is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Chicago. Ward is best known for her work on 19th and 20th century modern art and on the history of museum practices. This latter is the territory for her forthcoming book called The Art Show, which we look forward to publishing at the press in due course. So welcome to you both. And before I turn the Zoom over to Marty, I guess everybody's already muted. I'll mention that we're recording this event and there will be time for questions after the conversation. So Marty, without further ado, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Susan. So I'm delighted to be here to talk with Debra about this volume, which I have to say was a revelation to me. I knew Rosenberg to be the critic who had fashioned the term action painting in an essay of the early 1950s, and I knew him as the chief rival to Clement Greenberg's formalist account of the development of avant-garde painting in America. So I knew he was essential to understanding the reception of mid-century American modernist painting. But I have to say, I now realize how little I knew about his involvement really for decades, from the 1930s to the early 80s, with so many key figures in the intellectual and cultural life of this country. There's just an extraordinary array of fascinating figures with whom he engages, often in contentious debate, a little bit more rarely in highly sympathetic rapport in the pages of your book, Debra. And I think one of the great achievements of the book is to be both a biography of Rosenberg, really the first substantial one, and an exploration through him of these crucial cultural and intellectual debates during these years. So it's an intellectual and a cultural biography that we have here above all. Just one more note of introduction to pick up on what Susan already mentioned. The book's been a long time in the making, and for very good reason. You put so much of this book together from scratch, some 50 archives. I didn't count how many interviews were involved in it. And I think for decades to come, readers, historians, critics are going to be thanking you for excavating much of what there is there to be known about Rosenberg's life and his intellectual and cultural engagement. So it's really a monumental achievement.
Thank you.
Congratulate you on
Thank
that.
you so much.
Yeah. So why don't we start at the beginning?
Okay.
And work our way through some of the high points of Rosenberg's life and of your biography. So you begin by providing an engaging portrait of his childhood and of his physical demeanor. And this really, I think, sets the stage for the understanding we develop of what a distinctive personality and physical presence he was throughout his life. So why don't you describe him for us, and if you'd like, read a passage or from this early childhood section.
Okay, well, why don't I read briefly from the prologue to the book, where I do describe Rosenberg's upbringing in Brooklyn, his enrollment in Erasmus Hall, which was an elite school in Brooklyn, and which I feel in many ways shapes his independent intellectual outlook. So here goes from the prologue. Harold Rosenberg always resisted the in crowd. From the moment he entered Erasmus Hall in 1919, an elite high school in Brooklyn, he felt ostracized by the rivaling cliques of students who dominated the social scene. Many came from rich families, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, but he found no common ground with even the few freshmen who lived in his own dreary neighborhood of Borough Park. His father, while intellectually inclined, was a lower middle-class tailor who had moved the family from Harlem when Harold was 8 to settle in a Jewish community where the way of life was decidedly conformist. Religion became an anathema to Rosenberg. He hated the long, ritualized Saturday services, along with his father's bourgeois aspirations. By the time he attended Erasmus Hall, his anti-authoritarian streak was intact. The only place he felt at home was on the baseball field or when rowing on the lake in Prospect Park. To compound his sense of difference, Rosenberg grew to 6 feet 4 inches tall. By the time he was an adolescent, he towered not only over his family, but also over his teachers and fellow students. With his radiant dark eyes capped by black bushy brows and a prominent forehead, he came across as a colossus, a sort of oddity. To add to his eccentricity, his high-pitched nasal voice always seemed out of sync with his height. He lumbered through the corridors of Erasmus Hall, where he became more and more introverted and had little interaction with his classmates. As a result, studying became his primary outlet. In today's terms, he was a nerd. But once Rosenberg graduated, his disdain for the in-crowd intensified, as did his requirements for independence. These traits defined him and later seeped into his intellectual life, where he became known as a loner. He may have encountered many like-minded progressive thinkers in New York, but there were few occasions when he would become part of a community or cohesive social group, except when he was in the company of artists. Although Rosenberg would become one of the foremost American intellectuals of the mid-century, he was constitutionally incapable of fitting in. His aversion to the status quo had become ingrained since childhood, but as his success as a writer grew, his self-confidence soared. He became not only assertive, but also combative, undaunted by power. Many of his peers were put off by what they perceived as his arrogance. Others viewed his willful opposition to conformist culture as a strength, particularly when he stood up to the bullying of the American Communist Party during the Depression, which attempted to infiltrate publishing circles just as he came of age as a writer. But even his detractors knew that Rosenberg possessed a certain brilliance, particularly Clement Greenberg, the art critic for the Partisan Review and The Nation, who became one of his primary adversaries. As Greenberg admitted, Rosenberg's erudition was astonishing, even though he himself would never take to the philosophical thrust of Rosenberg's essays, he came to feel undone by Rosenberg's prominence and reputation.
Great, that's a very vivid portrait of him. One of the things I found quite interesting to think about in the book is these lower class origins and how they may have shaped for him a sense of where he could belong or not belong, how he would situate himself in relationship to high culture.
Right.
Which I mean, say a little bit about what difference it made later on to him,
Well,
about how
yeah, well,
he felt comfortable or felt that he could position himself.
you know, I think that Rosenberg never felt uncomfortable in the social circles that he would eventually be admitted to, particularly when he would start to write for The New Yorker in 1962, which was a highly visible literary platform. And he was, you know, constantly invited to, you know, numerous social events particularly, you know, at museums. But Rosenberg took it all in stride. I mean, unlike other figures, he wasn't swayed by this culture. And I believe that he continued to maintain his independence throughout his literary career.
I get the sense, though, that you also feel there's a contrast with Greenberg there, right?
There's a definite contrast with Greenberg, which, you know, really is etched from the beginning of their relationship. They meet in the mid-1930s. Rosenberg is 3 years older than Greenberg. Rosenberg has already established his prominence as a writer through writing for little magazines such as Transition, Symposium, and Poetry Magazine, the magazine that's based in Chicago. And Greenberg was deeply aware of his growing stature as a writer, and they maintained a friendship until they were both invited to write for the newly restructured Partisan Review, which had earlier been an organ of the John Reed Club and later dissociates itself from its communist politics and is restructured as a liberal progressive publication. But Rosenberg, during that period of time, is on the Writers Project. Unlike Greenberg, he has to relocate to Washington, D.C., and Greenberg is made an editor of the publication, something Rosenberg felt should have been his appointment. And so this growing rift ensues between these two figures, and the stark differences in their interpretive approaches to art becomes increasingly apparent from that moment onward. And Greenberg especially will become a deeply envious and rivalrous opponent of Rosenberg's growing existential thought.
Great. And maybe let's talk a little bit about a little bit more about the differences in their criticism. I get the sense that I know from having read both of them, they seem to have thought art criticism should do different things. I mean, they wrote different kinds of art criticism, and I'm wondering what is good art criticism for Rosenberg, do you think?
Okay, well, I should say that both Greenberg and Rosenberg started as Marxists, although Greenberg's socialist leanings will very quickly, become eviscerated and drop out of his interpretive outlook, and he will become what we refer to as a formalist. You know, his mission, he feels, is to describe the pictorial ingredients of a work of art and how those ingredients are knit into a linear unfolding of art, a stylistic unfolding of art from the Renaissance onwards. Rosenberg feels that it's more his mission to tie art to political and historic and cultural transformations within the culture in which contemporary art is being produced. And as he travels as a writer through the decade of the 40s, he will become increasingly associated with existentialist thinking, which will account for part of the reason that he will eventually write for Jean-Paul Sartre's publication in Paris, Les Temps Modernes, and become the American correspondent for that publication. So there is a pretty wide rift from the very beginning between their interpretive stances.
Yeah. And so let's turn to this mid-century moment when the American Action Painters essay is written. And one of the things that I found quite helpful and interesting about the book is that you don't just pick up the word action there,
Right.
but it appears repeatedly in your discussion of essays that he's written in the 1930s. And just tell us a little bit about why this word was so important for him at different points in his career up until the mid-50s.
Well, I should say, first of all, I think that, it's the great misunderstanding of many contemporary scholars that Rosenberg uses this word action for the first time in 1952 in the American Action Painters. I mean, because it had been present in his writing from the early 30s onwards. And in the 1930s, he will use the word action. He will also found a journal called The New Act. But he will use this word action to link it to various political developments current within the Great Depression. So it will be tinged with political overtones. It will gradually acquire existential overtones during the decade of the 1940s as he's becoming aware of new translations of Kierkegaard's texts, namely Fear and Trembling. Kierkegaard is a proto-existentialist thinker. And then eventually in the mid-1940s, when he meets Sartre and de Beauvoir in New York, he will become in the face of a burgeoning corporate and conformist culture. And eventually, that kind of meaning will be diluted. And by 1952, when he writes the American Action Painters, he's going to talk about what he refers to as this space between art and politics, this kind of gray zone where art unravels, and it's attached to, it draws from both aspects. But by 1968, the word action is going to completely drop out of Rosenberg's vocabulary, and that will be coincident with him assuming his position as the art critic for The New Yorker.
Yeah, no, that's it really is quite fascinating to track this, and also to see these big stakes for Rosenberg as he tries to straddle both Marxism and American individuality.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. He never really gives up on his Marxism, actually. I mean, he knows that Marxism really has no currency, especially after the end of World War II, but he'll always remain committed to the ethical aspects of Marxism.
Yeah. And you just an aside, you provide a very interesting picture of his heroes and quite an assortment of literary figures as well as personal figures for him. Hamlet, Lenin.
Yeah, Hamlet, Lenin, the Dostoevsky. And this will recur throughout his writing until the very end, actually.
Yeah. And it explains to me very clearly why Rosenberg hated one of my favorite authors, Henry James.
Oh.
Nobody acts.
Well, that's interesting because that accounted for part of his rift with Philip Rov, who was one of the editors of the Partisan Review. And Rov was actually responsible for reviving an interest in Henry James in the mid-1940s. And Rosenberg made fun of it and referred to a collection of essays by James or short stories rather, that Rov edited as the Henry James delicatessen. And thereafter, Rosenberg was never appeared in the pages of the Partisan Review again.
Yeah. Okay, well, there's so much we could talk about, but let's move on and think some about his time at the New Yorker. And this raises, I think, a very interesting problem that you must have thought long and hard about in dealing with Rosenberg, because there are these contradictions and tensions in terms of how he represents himself, how he understood himself as an outsider,
Right.
you evoked in your opening passage, and his actual situation at different times. So, you're not an outsider writing criticism for the New Yorker, nor are you outside if you're a member of the Committee on Social Thought. We'll get to that. And he liked to advocate for revolutionary positions, but he supervised in the 1930s the writing of American guidebooks. He worked during the war for the American, is it Advertising Council? Have I got that?
Yeah, the American Ad Council, yes.
Ideological slogans. So, how do you think he dealt with these contradictions and tensions in his own representation or self-understanding of his social position and the actual place that he occupied at various times?
Well, when Rosenberg was invited by William Shawn to become an art critic in 1967, after having worked at the New Yorker for a year from 62 to 63, where he spelled Robert Coates, the resident art critic who was on medical leave, he was completely astonished to be invited back. He had no sense of an audience for his work. And in fact, he worried about that. He worried that his writing wouldn't be accessible to the New Yorker audiences. So I think by temperament, Rosenberg was always an outsider, even though he had this highly visible platform at one of the foremost literary establishment publications of the day. But Shawn gave him free will to write about whatever he wanted. And I mean, within the art community, he was not able to write literary criticism for the New Yorker after 1968. There are a few reviews that, book reviews that he will publish, but those kinds of reviews would find a home in places like the New York Review of Books. But again, by temperament, he always felt to be an outsider. I think in part because he gained this affiliation with the New Yorker only when he was 61 years of age. He never expected to have an appointment. He never felt that there was a home for his writing. He had written for numerous publications from the 40s onwards. Commentary magazine was a place where he frequently published. He would publish for the British publication Encounter. He would write for Art News. He would write for Dissent magazine, but he was never ever offered a position at any of those publications. So Shawn's offer took him by complete surprise. And I think at the age of 61, he was he was unwilling, to give up his independent outlook. And so, no, he never became an establishment figure.
Yeah. And I think he probably understood formalism and the Greenberg camp
Right.
to be, to use his word, in an establishment
Right.
that he was outside of.
He was outside of, yes, exactly. And, I should also say in 1962, Art Forum magazine is established, the same year that the New York Review of Books is. But Art Forum becomes very quickly, a home for Greenberg's ideas, as they are spewed by a younger generation of art critics. And I'm thinking primarily of an art critic like Michael Fried. And even though he was invited a couple of times to publish in Art Forum, he really did not feel that his ideas could be framed by that publication, in part because he would continue to adopt, he would continue to write about art from a dialectical, point of view, rather than from a strict formalist analysis. So he dissociated himself from Art Forum and the new young writers, or, very, very quickly on. So no, he was never really an establishment figure. I mean, his ideas never became institutionalized in the same way that formalist art criticism did through Art Forum.
Yeah. So let's move a little bit further forward in his career. Since the University of Chicago Press has published your book, and that's quite appropriate since they also published 3 anthologies of Rosenberg's essay, and he joined the faculty here on in the Committee on Social Thought.
Right.
And when 1960, mid-60s, 66, I think.
Yeah, 66, and he doesn't get to University of Chicago until 67, and that's also the same year that he will take up his position at the New Yorker. And again, the appointment at Chicago was a complete surprise to Rosenberg. He had taught only once before. He had taught at the New School in the early 1950s. He, of course, had been invited to lecture, at numerous universities, as of the late 1950s, especially when the first collection of his writing is published, The Tradition of the New. But the appointment at Chicago was, again, a surprise. And it came through his great friends, Saul Bellow and Hannah Arendt, who also served on the Committee of Social Thought. And teaching actually became an unexpected pleasure for Rosenberg, at least at the beginning. He really enjoyed the community of intellectuals, in particular, who served on the Committee for Social Thought.
Yeah, you say at one point you think it was I forget whether it was the perfect fit for him or he was the perfect fit for it.
Right.
But
yeah.
Quite striking there.
Yeah, so I sort of wonder, because, as Rosenberg is reviewing these new mega shows that are appearing at New York institutions, and I'm thinking primarily of exhibitions like the huge extravaganza that Henry Geltzeller will assemble for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1970 on American painting from 1940 to 1970s, he begins to disdainfully refer to him and Bill Rubin at the Museum of Modern Art and Robert Rosenblum, who was contributing to these publications, as professors. And, so I wonder, has Rosenberg really become a professor himself once he lands in Chicago? But again, I think that, like Bellow, we wouldn't refer to Bellow as a professor. He's identified primarily through his writing. And I think that, the same could be said of Rosenberg.
Yeah, the Committee on Social Thought was and still is a unique.
Yes,
academia.
absolutely.
So, Debra, tell us why we should care about Rosenberg now. I mean, why, aside from those of us who are historians and want the record to be there, and certainly appreciate this book as a work of history. But if we advance to now and pose the why now question, maybe I think you have things to say about that towards the end of the book, right?
Sure, I can read from that, or I can just synthesize too. I mean, maybe it'd be easier for me just to talk about this two primary points that I feel about his deep relevance at this moment in time. So, as Rosenberg began to review exhibitions for the New Yorker after 1968, he began to embark on what we now refer to as institutional critique. And he noted that many of the interpreters of late modernist and contemporary art, their stances were really abetted by formalist art criticism. That is, they didn't look beyond the work of art. So hence there was no discussion of there were these claims that the museum was a neutral institution, and again, it was aided by formalist criticism, because formalist criticism doesn't take into consideration, the politics of exclusion. Who doesn't get folded into these exhibitions and why? And that was something that Rosenberg would question at every turn when he would review these exhibitions for the New Yorker. And in 1977, one of the last pieces that he writes is a review of an exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum called 200 Years of Black American Art. And in that review, he noted that many of these formalist critics had never reviewed artists like Jacob Lawrence, Romare Burden, or Elma Thomas, or others. And he then goes on to make this very provocative statement where he states, apparently aesthetics is a function of racism. And I think that statement alone has enormous currency for what we're dealing with in our culture at this moment in time, and was extraordinarily prescient on his part, and something that I think reverberates widely.
Great. I see Susan has rejoined us.
Okay.
And I believe this was going to be perhaps a sign that we were going to open things up to questions.
Well, I can do that. I have to say, I also said that if you were ripping along full tilt, I wasn't going to intrude. Would you like to maybe
why don't we
up over a couple of minutes, or do you want to go ahead and open it to questions now?
Do we have some questions?
Yeah, why don't we see if there are questions, and if there aren't, then we'll just continue on.
Okay. How do we do that? Do people raise their hands or put it in chat?
Oh, here we have. Here's somebody's raised their hand.
Okay.
Hi. My question's a little bit selfish because I'm finishing a book on Lionel Trilling.
Oh, wow. I'm glad to hear this one.
I'm wondering, I know I've read through some of the letters in the Trilling archive he exchanged with Rosenberg, mostly in the 60s. And I also think that Trilling's review of the de-definition of art is one of a great review that kind of speaks to how Trilling and Rosenberg's ideas overlap with each other. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship as it grew, especially in light of what you said about him falling out with the partisan review. Anything about the relationship I'd be interested in.
Well, I didn't come across a lot of correspondence between the two of them. However, I do find mention of, Trilling in numerous other letters. And, they certainly knew each other. He knew Diana Trilling for sure. They were, socially acquainted. But, for Rosenberg, I think that Trilling, given his position at Columbia University, was one of these professors that, even though he didn't write about, Trilling's work, was somebody who, again, he did not feel completely comfortable with. I mean, the person at Columbia that Rosenberg was most associated with and who became a very close friend of his was Meyer Shapiro.
Mhm.
And Shapiro and Trilling. I mean, you could probably tell me more about that relationship, but was it close?
Somewhat. Shapiro was a little bit older, I believe,
Right.
than Trilling. But the one thing that I know, I read 2 letters in the Trilling archive that they exchanged, and the topic of the letters was on irony. And
Mhm.
Trilling's critique, not Trilling's critique, Trilling was talking to Rosenberg about how no one, with respect to his book Beyond Culture, no one's understanding the irony of it. That I'm not asking for us to transcend culture. I'm saying there's no escape from it. And he says, you're the only one who really understands. You're the only one who could get it. And I think, it would make sense that Trilling becomes the embodiment of Columbia's humanist tradition, so to speak, but he hated his reputation. He hated the university, and he always would have imagined himself as the outsider that
That's
Rosenberg is
interesting.
depicted. That's kind of a central overlap, at least in terms of my interest in Rosenberg, is Trilling hated institutions. And he writes in his diaries about he says, quote, "I have the greatest reputation in the literary world, and I loathe it."
Interesting. Wow.
He wanted to be a novelist. He wanted to be Hemingway, Lawrence, and Thomas Mann combined into one.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rosenberg wanted to become an artist at the outset of his career, and he knew he didn't have the talent. He also wanted to become a poet, and he gave up on poetry by 1942 for literary and cultural commentary.
And you quote some of his poetry, and I have to say we understand why he didn't go on with
Right.
it.
Yeah. I don't think Rosenberg was an achieved poet.
That was not. Is there another hand up here?
Susan.
I'm seeing Eleanor Hartney's.
Oh, yeah.
Go to Eleanor first.
Oh, you know what that is? I'm sorry. That's the pointer on my computer screen, which just happened to be superimposed on her and shows up.
Well, I actually do have a question that I can ask. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, of course, fascinated me as an art critic, was just what a struggle it was financially for Rosenberg, and that in certain ways, I guess things haven't really changed that much, but that, until he ended up at the New Yorker, he was sort of ricocheting all over the place. And of course, he wasn't just an art critic, he was a cultural critic doing these things, but what a difficult thing it was for, I guess, anyone to be that kind of a public intellectual at that time. And yet,
Right.
They persevered. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, Rosenberg had this very interesting part-time day job. As of 1942, he began to work for the American Ad Council. During the war, after the Federal Writers Project was dissolved, he worked for a number of different government agencies, including the Office of War Information. And that interestingly morphed into the American Ad Council, where he worked for almost 30 some years, up until about 1971. It supported his writing. He couldn't have done it otherwise. And I guess in large part because, again, he was never offered an editorial appointment at any of these publications until 1967, 68 at the New Yorker. So he had this very supportive colleague who was the head of the Ad Council by the name of George Ludlam, who worried about his material existence and said, look, just come in, just sit at this desk 3 days a week, write your art criticism and overview, and take note of the various ad campaigns that we're embarking on. And one of the more prominent ad campaigns that he did oversee was the Smokey the Bear campaign. He didn't write the copy for that. That was written by one of the outside ad agencies who donated their time to the American Ad Council. But I also sort of think, the Ad Council informed a lot of Rosenberg's aphoristic phrasing, like these great titles, for his essay, like The Herd of Independent Minds, The American Action Painters, Death in the Wilderness. All of that, I think, comes out of that experience.
So Susan has put a question here in the chat. Deborah, you mentioned Rosenberg's remarks about racism and aesthetics. Has that been taken up by today's discourse? Has he been noticed on that front?
No, he hasn't, because I was the first to publish that, an interpretation of that essay. So I have noted, however, that a lot of people are tweeting about that phrase. But again, I think that's part of his great prescience as a writer.
I have another question. So yours is a chronological view of his career, but it's not a conventional narrative structure that you have. And so I wonder if you could talk about the craft of writing this book and why you wrote it in the way that you did, because each chapter, it seems to me, concentrates on his engagement with a set of interlocutors, debaters is a better word in his case, and the crucial issues at play at that moment. And so we really go, and I think this is what makes it very much of an intellectual and cultural history of the United States during these years, or his engagement with that. So could you talk a little bit about, what I would characterize as a kind of dialogical way of exploring Rosenberg, almost always in relationship to others?
Right. Well, this is the first book on Rosenberg to begin with. There have been essays over the years, not many, but I really felt that because Rosenberg is only known by one essay, The American Action Painters, perhaps two, The Herd of Independent Minds, but primarily the American Action Painters, that he really had to be situated over 5 or 6 decades in terms of these very interesting but contentious intellectual debates that unfolded, as of 1929, the Great Depression, through the late 1960s, so that the reader had some understanding of his prominence and place within this intellectual culture. Again, I think that the great misreading of Rosenberg is that he commenced his career as an art critic, which is untrue. I mean, that doesn't really happen until the American Action Painters. And even after the American Action Painters, he writes very, very few essays on art criticism until he gets to the New Yorker in 1962 for a year. So the fact that he took part in these debates that related to the growing prominence of the new criticism, or formalism as we would refer to it in the art world, the fact that he participated in mid-century debates that related to how to name the so-called new American painting that was emerging in the mid-1940s. I mean, a movement that will eventually be called abstract expressionism or the New York School, but Rosenberg weighs in with his own term, the American Action Painters, and that he will also take part, in discussing very highly charged debates that relate to the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. I think became very important to me for the reader to have a much broader, understanding of his place within intellectual culture in this country.
Yeah, and you say towards the end, there's a compelling part of towards the end where you talk about his wondering what his writing would amount to. and that it's not, it can't be constituted as a theory.
Right.
So very different, right, from Greenberg, and but that he always wanted to be in a debate, right, of the moment.
Right.
And so I wondered if that too played into the way you chose to structure the book, that it's very crucial to understand him, not really in the conventional sense of context, but in the sense of being in the midst of a debate that mattered.
Right. You know, I think at the end of Rosenberg's life, he's thinking very, very deeply about whether he has a legacy, as do all artists and writers and thinkers, and what his contribution might have been. And he does know that his thought could not be codified in the same way that materialist interpretation, formalist material interpretation could be. So, you know, what is his legacy? And I think that he falls back on his role as an outsider, and thinks that, his opposition, to mass culture in the 30s and 40s, and eventually to a burgeoning corporate culture, and the kind of conformity that those cultures induce, is really part of what he hopes will be emulated by a subsequent generation of art critics, figures who are not part of a literary establishment, in figures who are always straddling that fine line between, acceptance and non-acceptance. I mean, that,
Relevance now?
Yeah, I think that has deep relevance now. Yes. Yeah. Especially in terms of as we assess the kind of scene for art criticism at this very moment, where publications have disappeared over the past couple of decades. But then we have this the emergence of these these very progressive online publications or zines, like Hyperallergic and the Brooklyn Rail, which are nonconformist. And I'd like to think that that's where Rosenberg would have chosen to publish if he was still around.
That's great. Well, what do you think? Shall we wrap it up on that note? That's a kind of high note. Are there any more questions? Any more questions? Well, if not, I want to thank Marty and Deborah. Please, thank you so much. This was fascinating. It was so fascinating, I didn't want to interrupt at all. And
I think
we're losing Susan.
in hardback and as an ebook. And if you're of a mind to pick up a copy, we'd always urge you to do so through the seminary co-op if it's convenient. So upon that note, shall we close down for now?
Thank you, Susan, for organizing this. I really appreciate it.
Doing this. It was wonderful.
And thank you, Marty. It was a great conversation.
pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Well, take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.